3 o'clock in the morning, and the executive floor of Kingsley Industries was still burning with light because a deal worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime was about to collapse. Helena Kingsley stood at the window with a cold cup of coffee in her hand, watching the reflection of a man on his knees behind her, wiping a spilled drink off the marble floor, while 3 directors laughed about something that had nothing to do with him. By day he repaired machines in the industrial yard, by night he emptied trash cans and scrubbed floors, and on weekends he delivered parts across the city. Yet no one had ever heard him complain. Helena turned, and without thinking, she asked him a question that felt harmless. "Don't you ever rest?" The man lifted his head, his eyes rimmed red from exhaustion, and answered with 3 words that made the entire room go silent, because none of them yet understood that those 3 words were about to bring an empire of lies crashing down around them. If you believe dignity is worth more than a title, press subscribe now and follow the story of the man who forced an entire corporation to finally open its eyes. 12 hours before that silence fell over the executive floor, Evan Calder woke in the dark at 4:20 in the morning in a small rented house on the edge of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the furnace rattled and the porch light had burned out weeks ago, and he had not yet found the time to replace it. He packed 3 lunches in mismatched containers, checked an overdue electric bill folded into quarters on the kitchen counter, and slipped out the door before his children could wake and ask him why he looked so tired again. On the table, his youngest daughter had left a note in careful, rounded handwriting that read, "Tonight I will save you a piece of pie," and Evan folded it once, twice, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his work jacket, like it was something worth more than the check he would earn that week. He drove through empty streets past shuttered diners and dark storefronts, thinking about the hydraulic press waiting for him on the factory floor, a machine an outside repair crew had already condemned as unsalvageable, a machine that would cost the company tens of thousands of dollars to replace. He passed the same darkened bakery every morning without stopping, the smell of bread drifting out through a cracked vent even before the owner unlocked the front door. And some mornings he allowed himself to imagine bringing the children there on a Saturday, the way other fathers seemed to do without a second thought. That imagining never lasted long, because by the time he reached the parking lot of Kingsley Industries, his mind had already shifted to the list of tasks waiting for him inside. The press that needed attention, the supply cart that needed restocking, the names on his overtime sheet that his supervisor always seemed reluctant to approve in full. Evan had learned, slowly and without bitterness, that a man could carry an entire household on his back and still remain almost invisible to the people who signed his paycheck, and he had stopped expecting anything different from the building he walked into 6 days a week. At Kingsley Industries, Evan walked the length of the press with a flashlight and a notebook, running his palm along seams and bolts that younger technicians had never learned to read by feel. Within an hour he had identified a single failing valve, a part that cost less than $6, and by sunrise the press was running again as though it had never faltered at all. His supervisor filed a report that simply stated the maintenance team had resolved the issue, without a single mention of the man who had actually crawled beneath the machine and saved the company a fortune before most of the building had even finished its coffee. Ruth Bennett, the night shift supervisor who had watched Evan work for 3 years, found him afterward and told him, gently, that his 11th application for a process engineer position had been rejected again, this time without so much as an interview. Evan did not argue and did not sigh. He simply wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades and said that he still had the night shift ahead of him. And Ruth watched him walk away, wondering how a man so clearly capable kept being told, in 100 quiet ways, that he did not matter. She had known Evan long enough to remember the year he first arrived at the plant, quiet and guarded, still carrying the weight of his wife's illness in the way he moved and spoke, and she had watched him slowly rebuild a kind of steadiness that most people never noticed because he never asked anyone to notice it. Ruth had once suggested he take his old resume to a different company entirely, somewhere that might value his background without holding his years away from engineering against him. But Evan had only shrugged and said the bills would not wait for him to start over somewhere new. That conversation had stayed with her, and every time another rejection letter arrived, she felt a small, familiar anger on his behalf that she never quite knew what to do with. While he worked the press, Evan noticed something that nagged at him the way a splinter does long after you have stopped looking for it. The failures on the line, the ones that had been quietly blamed on aging equipment for months, always seemed to occur roughly 17 minutes after a particular shipment of components was loaded into the system. It was too precise to be coincidence and too small for anyone with a spreadsheet and a corner office to notice. But Evan had spent years learning that machines rarely lied, even when the people who ran them did. He glanced at the production schedule pinned to the wall of the maintenance office and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, a cold and specific suspicion that somewhere inside this building, someone was deliberately slowing the line down while making sure no alarm ever sounded to say so. He said nothing about it to his supervisor, partly because he had no proof yet, and partly because he had learned that raising concerns above his position tended to earn him suspicion rather than gratitude. Instead, he began copying the timestamps into his own notebook whenever he had a spare minute, not because he expected anyone to ask for it, but because writing things down had always been the one habit that made an uncertain world feel a little more manageable. After his maintenance shift ended, Evan changed into a plain gray uniform to cover for the cleaning crew, which had been short 2 people for a month because management refused to approve new hires while insisting productivity remain unchanged. At the very same hour, on the 47th floor, Helena Kingsley called an emergency meeting because Atlas Medical, the company's largest client, had threatened to cancel a contract worth more money than the Pittsburgh plant made in half a year, citing repeated late shipments that no one in the boardroom could adequately explain. If the contract collapsed, the plant could close its doors entirely, and nearly 900 employees would lose their jobs within a matter of weeks, a number that the directors seated around the long glass table discussed the way other people discussed the weather. The directors ordered expensive food that none of them finished, argued over which departments could absorb the deepest cuts, and largely ignored the man mopping quietly near the wall until one of them knocked over a full cup of coffee and made no move to clean it himself. Their conversation drifted between spreadsheets and vacation plans as though the two carried equal weight, and more than once someone laughed at a private joke, while a chart on the screen behind them showed hundreds of livelihoods reduced to a single declining line. None of them thought to ask the man refilling their water glasses whether he had opinions about the numbers they were debating, because, in their minds, the categories of person who cleaned a room and person who understood it had never once overlapped. Instead, he glanced at Evan and said, "At least someone in this room is still making money off all this chaos tonight." And several of his colleagues laughed at the joke while Helena said nothing to stop them, distracted by numbers on a screen that refused to make sense, no matter how many times she recalculated them. When she finally looked up and saw Evan gripping the handle of his cart for balance, swaying slightly with the particular exhaustion of a man running on no sleep and too much coffee, something in her hesitated, and she asked him, almost without meaning to, whether he worked the morning shift at the plant too, and whether he ever allowed himself to rest. Evan felt the edge of his daughter's note pressing against his chest, through the fabric of his jacket, and he thought, briefly, of the electric bill, the tuition his eldest daughter had quietly decided not to pursue, and the years he had spent choosing his family over every version of the future he had once imagined for himself. He did not explain any of it. He simply looked at Helena Kingsley, the woman who owned the building he was cleaning and the machines he had spent all night repairing, and said 3 words that landed in that room like a verdict rather than a complaint. "My kids eat," and then he lowered his eyes and kept working as though nothing had happened at all. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was the kind of silence that changes the temperature of a room permanently. Helena felt something twist in her chest that she could not immediately name, something closer to shame than pity, because the man standing in front of her had just described, in 3 plain words, the entire reason he pushed himself past the point most people would consider reasonable. Before she could say anything else, Evan glanced toward the production chart, still glowing on the screen behind her, the same chart the directors had been arguing over for the better part of an hour, and said quietly that they were all looking in the wrong place for their answer. Preston Vale, the company's operations director, immediately demanded that Evan leave the room, insisting with visible irritation that a member of the cleaning staff had no business commenting on operational data that cost the company millions of dollars to generate. Helena, to the surprise of nearly everyone present, held up a hand and asked Evan to keep talking, a decision that made Preston's jaw tighten in a way he clearly tried and failed to hide. Evan explained, in plain and unhurried language, that the shutdowns on the line were not random at all, and that every one of them occurred shortly after a specific batch of components from a supplier called Northcrest Components entered the system. The problem, he said, was not that the parts were defective, but that their timestamps had been shifted by exactly 17 minutes, which caused the software to misclassify functioning components as unverified and trigger an unnecessary halt. One of the senior engineers in the room scoffed openly, suggesting that a man who mopped floors for a living was hardly qualified to contradict software that had cost the company millions to install and maintain. Evan did not raise his voice or defend his credentials. He simply asked the engineer whether he had ever stood beside that particular line at 3 in the morning and watched it fail in real time, and when no one answered, the silence spoke for itself far more effectively than any argument could have. Helena watched the exchange closely, noticing that Evan never once raised his voice or reached for a clever retort, choosing instead to let the weight of a simple, unanswerable question do the work for him, a restraint that struck her as far more persuasive than anything she had seen from the polished consultants the company usually paid a fortune to hear. Preston, sensing the room's attention shifting away from him, accused Evan of manufacturing a crisis in order to draw attention to himself, and pointedly reminded everyone present that Evan had applied for a promotion 11 separate times and been rejected on every occasion, a detail clearly meant to humiliate him in front of the very executives he had just addressed. Evan absorbed the remark without flinching and answered that he was not there seeking a title or a raise, and that if the plant closed, hundreds of other families would soon be working 3 jobs the way he did, just to keep food on the table. Helena studied him for a long moment, no longer with pity but with something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind she had not felt toward an employee in longer than she cared to admit. Before the meeting adjourned, she instructed Human Resources to send her Evan's complete personnel file by morning, a request that made Mallory Crane, the company's head of Human Resources, visibly pale for reasons she did not immediately explain. Alone in her office before dawn, Helena read through Evan's file and discovered a version of him that no one on the executive floor had ever bothered to look for. Years earlier, he had worked as a systems engineer at Ridgewell Automation, where he co-developed a predictive maintenance method that reduced line downtime by nearly 30%, an achievement buried beneath a single line in an otherwise unremarkable employment history. His career had stalled when his wife, Claire Calder, was diagnosed with a long illness that eventually claimed her life, and Evan had stepped away from engineering entirely to care for her and their 3 children, a gap in his resume that every hiring algorithm in the building had apparently interpreted as a red flag rather than an act of love. What angered Helena most was discovering that Evan had met every listed qualification for at least 7 internal positions at Kingsley Industries over the past several years, and had been rejected from each one within days of applying. Buried in the notes attached to his file was a single automated phrase that read, "Not a fit for leadership culture," a judgment issued without a single interview or conversation. When Helena confronted Mallory about the language, Mallory blamed an outdated screening system, insisting the wording was generated automatically and meant nothing personal. But when Helena pulled the login history behind each rejected application, she found that every single one had been opened and closed by the same account, an account that belonged to Preston Vale's office hours before each rejection was finalized. She sat with that discovery longer than she expected to, staring at the pattern on her screen until the numbers blurred, because it meant someone in her own leadership team had spent years quietly deciding, again and again, that a man like Evan Calder did not deserve a chance to rise. It was not a single mistake or a careless oversight. It was a deliberate and repeated choice made by a person with the authority to know better, and the longer Helena looked at it, the harder it became to separate her anger at Preston from a quieter, more uncomfortable anger at herself for never once thinking to check. Helena found Evan in the maintenance bay the next morning and asked him directly to prove what he had claimed in the boardroom. He agreed, but on his own terms, requesting 12 hours of access to the plant's maintenance data and permission to speak candidly with the workers on the night shift, without anyone from management present to filter their answers. He asked for no money and no promotion, only the chance to be believed for once. And before Helena walked away, he offered her a warning that would echo through everything that followed, telling her that if he was right, the plant was not experiencing accidents at all. Someone was manufacturing them on purpose. Evan spent the next several hours working alongside Ruth, pulling every repair log from the previous 6 months and laying them side by side across a folding table in the break room. A pattern emerged almost immediately, one that no algorithm had ever been asked to look for, showing that nearly every major failure occurred just before an important financial review, and that after each failure, Preston personally approved the purchase of replacement parts from North Crest Components at prices nearly 4 times higher than the market rate. Night shift workers, it turned out, had submitted repeated warnings about the line over the preceding months, but Ruth discovered that the language in those reports had been quietly altered before reaching upper management, softened until the warnings barely resembled the original complaints at all. Helena, watching Evan work from a distance, noticed something that struck her more than any spreadsheet could have. He never tried to prove he was smarter than anyone else in the room, and before drawing a single conclusion, he asked the people who actually operated the machines what they had seen and felt, a habit none of her own senior managers had ever practiced in her presence. Evan eventually determined that the problem could be corrected by restoring an older scanning schedule and manually inspecting 3 specific batches of components, a fix that, if it worked, would allow the plant to meet its deadline for the Atlas medical shipment without further delay. Just as he prepared to test his theory on the live line, however, plant security arrived and escorted him away from the control panel without explanation. Preston stood waiting near the security office with a tight, satisfied expression, holding up camera footage that appeared to show Evan standing near the control panel only minutes before the line's most severe failure to date. He announced, loudly enough for the gathering crowd of workers to hear, that they had finally found their saboteur, and Evan was suspended on the spot, escorted out in front of colleagues who had, until an hour earlier, barely known his name. A few of the older workers exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to say anything out loud but clearly unconvinced that the quiet man who had spent years patching their machines together was capable of the thing he was being accused of. Ruth tried to intervene, insisting there had to be an explanation, but security had already been given their instructions, and within minutes Evan was standing outside the front gate holding a cardboard box, watching the building he had given so many years to grow smaller in his rearview mirror. Preston accused Evan of deliberately causing failures on the line so that he could later appear as the hero who solved them, a theory Mallory quickly reinforced by reminding everyone of his long history of promotion requests, framing his ambition as motive rather than diligence. Some of the same managers who had once mocked Evan for his exhaustion now seemed eager to believe the worst about him, nodding along as though the story confirmed something they had suspected all along. Helena did not fully believe Preston's version of events, but the footage left her uncertain, and when she gave Evan the chance to explain himself, he refused to name the worker who had asked him to check the control panel that night, unwilling to risk that person's job to save his own reputation. His silence, meant as an act of loyalty, only made him appear more suspicious to everyone watching. Evan was walked out of the building carrying a small box containing his work gloves, an untouched lunch, and years of rejected applications he had never bothered to throw away. On the drive home, his daughter Sadie called to tell him she had decided not to submit her deposit for college after all, insisting she simply was not ready yet, though Evan understood immediately that she was trying to lighten a burden she believed her father could no longer carry alone. He did not argue with her in that moment. He simply sat behind the wheel of his car in the empty parking lot, allowing himself, for the first time in years, to look as helpless as he actually felt. Later that night, Ruth called to warn him that the plant's maintenance system had automatically deleted every repair log from the previous 6 months, the very records that had proven the pattern behind the failures. Someone, it was now clear, was working quickly to erase every trace of evidence before it could be used against them. Evan sat in the dark of his kitchen for a long moment before reaching into a drawer and pulling out a worn leather notebook he had carried with him since his earliest years as an engineer. Every number, every timestamp, and every approval signature that had just vanished from the company's servers was still there, written in his own careful hand, page after page of proof that no one had thought to ask him about. Evan had kept that habit since his days at Ridgewell Automation, recording the date, machine number, component code, and approving signature for every repair he ever touched, long before he had any reason to suspect it would matter again. Laid out together, the entries formed an unmistakable pattern, showing that failures consistently followed Preston's requests to alter the plant's inspection schedule, never the other way around. Evan reached out to Walter Boone, the company's former head of quality control, who had retired years earlier after repeatedly warning executives about a supplier he no longer trusted. Walter confirmed that Northcrest components had once been removed from Kingsley's approved supplier list after submitting falsified certification documents, and that the company had mysteriously reappeared on the list shortly after his retirement, with Preston's signature attached to its reinstatement. Digging further, Evan and Ruth discovered that Northcrest had no actual manufacturing facility at all, and that its registered address led to an empty office suite owned by an investment firm run by Preston's brother-in-law. Walter's voice on the phone had carried a tired kind of relief. the sound of a man who had spent years believing no one would ever confirm what he already knew to be true, and he told Evan that he still kept copies of every report he had filed, tucked away in a filing cabinet in his garage, because some part of him had never quite trusted the company to keep its own records honestly. Meanwhile, working quietly on her own, Helena traced the company's financial records and found that tens of millions of dollars had been funneled to North Crest over several years, far more than any legitimate supplier relationship could explain. She cross-referenced the payments against board approvals and discovered that most of them had been authorized through a simplified process meant for routine purchases under a certain threshold. A threshold Preston had apparently learned to stay just beneath, deal after deal, for years without a single flag ever being raised. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that Preston was not simply stealing from the company he had sworn to protect. He was deliberately driving the Pittsburgh plant toward failure so that the board would eventually approve the sale of its land to a real estate developer eager to redevelop the site. A deal that would pay Preston a commission large enough to make every stolen dollar look small by comparison. Before Helena could act on what she had learned, Preston moved first, calling an emergency vote to remove her as chief executive, accusing her publicly of weak leadership and of protecting a saboteur at the expense of the company's future. The vote was scheduled for 6 o'clock the following morning, leaving Helena only hours to decide what kind of leader she actually wanted to be. Rather than retreating to her office to prepare talking points, Helena did something none of her predecessors had ever done, trading her tailored blazer for a plain work jacket and walking down to the factory floor without a single assistant trailing behind her. For the first time, she watched workers eat cold dinners beside their machines because the plant remained short-staffed, having gone hours without a proper break because there was no one available to cover their positions. She noticed a safety warning sign that had been removed entirely from the wall months earlier, taken down at Preston's direction because he believed it slowed productivity during inspections. A woman on the night shift told Helena that Evan often quietly repaired dangerous equipment before it could injure anyone, usually without mentioning it to a soul, and that he had once used his own overtime pay to help a coworker who had just lost her housing. Evan had never once told Helena any of this himself. Standing there among machines and tired faces, Helena finally understood that his answer in the boardroom, "My kids eat," had never been only about his own 3 children. It was an acknowledgement that behind every worker on that floor stood a family depending on wages that executives upstairs treated as an abstraction on a spreadsheet. Helena walked the length of the plant slowly, pausing at machines she had only ever seen in photographs attached to quarterly reports, and found herself asking workers simple questions she had never thought to ask before, about their shifts, their commutes, the small routines that made an impossible schedule survivable. Several of them answered cautiously at first, unused to a Kingsley in a work jacket standing close enough to hear them, but their guardedness softened as she kept listening instead of moving on, and by the end of the hour she understood the plant and the man she had suspended far better than any report had ever allowed her to. She drove to Evan's house that evening, not to offer charity or apology dressed up as kindness, but to admit plainly that she had spent years running a company built on reports that had quietly lied to her. Evan agreed to help her fight for the truth, but only under one condition, telling her firmly that no matter what happened next, no worker would be sacrificed to save the company's image. Helena accepted without hesitation, and when the two of them returned to the plant together, they discovered that Preston had already revoked Helena's access badge and instructed security to keep Evan from stepping past the front gate entirely. The board meeting began in the very room where Evan had once been mocked for his exhaustion, The long glass table now surrounded by directors who had gathered to decide whether Helena would keep her position at all. Preston opened with a polished presentation outlining his plan to close the Pittsburgh plant, sell the land beneath it, and shift production entirely to an outsourced facility hundreds of miles away, describing the current workforce in cold, clinical language as an inefficiency the company could no longer justify. Helena walked in with Evan and Ruth at her side, and Preston immediately objected, arguing that a suspended employee had no right to address the board at all. Helena set Evan's worn notebook directly on the center of the table and told the room that every director present deserved to know the plant was being deliberately sabotaged from within its own walls. Evan spoke plainly, without technical jargon or intimidating charts, placing 3 small boxes of components on the table instead and explaining, piece by piece, how the failures had been engineered on purpose, how unnecessary parts had been purchased at inflated prices, and how data had been altered to make the blame fall squarely on workers who had done nothing wrong. Walter joined the meeting by video call and confirmed that the signature reinstating North Crest as an approved supplier belonged unmistakably to Preston. Several directors around the table shifted uncomfortably as the pieces fell into place, some of them realizing for the first time how easily they had trusted numbers without ever asking who had produced them, and one older board member, a woman who had sat on the board since the founder's era, quietly asked Preston to explain himself before the vote proceeded any further. Preston's composure, so carefully maintained through years of polished presentations, began to fracture in small, visible ways, a stiffening of his jaw, a slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass, the first honest thing he had shown the room in a long time. Preston tried to regain control of the room by playing the security footage again, insisting it still proved Evan had tampered with the control panel. Evan calmly pointed out that 4 full minutes had been edited out of that footage, timestamps that vanished cleanly from the recording in a way no ordinary system glitch would ever produce, and he asked the board's technology director to verify the gap for herself before anyone drew further conclusions. Ruth confirmed under oath that she herself had asked him to inspect the panel that night, because the system had already been reporting false alerts, and she added, her voice steady despite the room full of executives watching her, that she would say the same thing in front of a courtroom if it ever came to that. Preston still held one card left to play, reminding the room that Atlas Medical would formally cancel its contract within 30 minutes unless Kingsley Industries could prove, immediately, that the production line was capable of running properly again. Smiling faintly, he told the room that even if they won this particular argument, the company would still collapse before the sun finished rising. Evan proposed switching the line to manual control, removing the falsified timestamps entirely, and physically re-inspecting the 3 suspect batches of components by hand rather than trusting software that had already been compromised. One director suggested pushing the machines beyond their safe operating limits to save time, a suggestion Evan refused outright, telling the room that saving a contract by putting workers in danger was simply another kind of failure dressed up to look like success. Helena publicly aligned herself with Evan's decision, fully aware that if his plan failed, she would likely lose both the vote and her career within the same hour. Ruth quickly gathered the night shift, and workers who had spent years being treated as replaceable numbers began coordinating seamlessly round a plan Evan sketched by hand on a whiteboard, moving with a kind of quiet urgency that came from finally being asked rather than ordered. People who had never exchanged more than a nod in the hallway suddenly found themselves working shoulder to shoulder, passing tools and calling out readings without needing to be told twice, as though some part of them had been waiting a long time for someone to trust them with exactly this kind of responsibility. A countdown clock on the wall ticked steadily downward, tightening the air in the room with every passing minute, and even Helena, standing near the doorway in her borrowed work jacket, found herself holding her breath along with everyone else on the floor. With only moments remaining, a sensor kept flashing an error that nearly derailed the entire effort until Evan realized it was not malfunctioning at all, but misreading a batch whose inspection seal had been deliberately swapped for a counterfeit one. He reordered the scan sequence by hand, allowing the line to resume without ever pushing the machines past their safe limits, and the very first finished product rolled off the line with less than 2 minutes remaining on the clock. Atlas Medical agreed to extend its contract after watching the entire recovery unfold in real time through a live video feed, visibly impressed by both the speed and the caution behind it. As workers on the floor allowed themselves a rare, unguarded cheer, Helena instructed security to lock both Preston's and Mallory's access credentials immediately, a decision that finally, and rather fittingly, sent someone else walking out of the building under close watch instead of Evan. An independent audit conducted in the following weeks confirmed that Preston had siphoned more than $30 million from the company through a network of falsified suppliers built almost entirely around North Crest components. Mallory was found to have altered hiring records, concealed unpaid overtime across multiple departments, and quietly maintained a private list of employees marked as unfit for promotion simply because they tended to ask too many uncomfortable questions. Preston attempted to shift blame onto subordinates during the investigation, insisting he had merely approved paperwork prepared by others and never fully understood the details himself. But every digital signature tied to the fraudulent contracts led directly back to his own office, leaving no room left for denial. Investigators noted that the sheer consistency of the scheme, carried out patiently over several years without a single slip, made his claim of ignorance almost impossible for anyone in the room to take seriously, and even his own legal counsel seemed to grow quieter with every new document that surfaced. Helena called a meeting for every employee at the plant, refusing to turn Evan into a charity case or a convenient symbol for the cameras. She stood in front of the entire workforce and openly admitted that the company had treated a genuinely skilled and hard-working man as disposable for years, despite everything he had quietly given to keep the plant running. She apologized directly to Evan and to every worker on the night shift who had been ignored, overworked, or blamed for problems they never caused. The room stayed quiet through most of what she said, not the tense silence of the boardroom weeks earlier, but something closer to relief, the particular stillness of people hearing, finally and plainly, a truth they had carried alone for far too long. A few workers wiped their eyes without embarrassment, and Ruth, standing near the back, allowed herself a small, tired smile she had been saving for exactly this moment. Evan did not ask for public humiliation of the people who had once looked down on him, nor did he demand a symbolic victory lap in front of his former critics. He asked instead for 3 specific things: that every dollar of unpaid overtime be returned in full, that the false performance reviews buried in employee files be permanently removed, and that no worker who had helped uncover the truth ever face retaliation for having done so. His calm, deliberate restraint made the outcome feel far more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could have, because he clearly had no interest in trading places with the people who had once tried to erase him, only in reshaping the system that had allowed them to succeed for so long. Some of the directors seemed almost unsettled by how little Evan wanted for himself, as though they had expected him to demand a corner office or a public reckoning, and instead found a man who simply wanted the truth recorded accurately and the people around him protected going forward. Days later, Helena invited Evan back up to the 47th floor, and this time, waiting on the table was not a cleaning cart, but a formal executive contract with his name printed clearly at the top. Helena offered Evan the position of Vice President of Operations, along with a salary that would finally mean he never had to work a second shift again for the rest of his life. He did not sign the contract right away. Instead, he asked that the title be changed to Director of Operational Integrity, a role with the authority to review every plant report personally and to protect any employee who came forward with a legitimate safety or ethics concern in the future. He also proposed a transparent internal hiring process open to every qualified employee, a technical scholarship fund for the children of plant workers, firm limits on mandatory overtime hours, the right for any worker to refuse an unsafe order without fear of punishment, and an emergency fund to support families facing sudden financial hardship. Helena agreed to every condition without hesitation, acknowledging openly that Evan had just saved the company in a way the board had never once considered possible. Within a few months, the Pittsburgh plant was running smoothly again, not because workers were pushed harder or faster, but because, for the first time in years, someone in leadership was actually listening to them. Sadie earned a merit-based scholarship of her own and decided to enroll after all, no longer believing her father needed to sacrifice his health just to keep her dream alive. Miles started staying after school for a robotics club he had quietly wanted to join for over a year but never mentioned, and June began leaving notes on the kitchen table again, though now they were simple reminders about homework rather than promises to save him a plate. Evan's co-workers, the same ones who once found it easy to overlook him, began stopping by his new office just to ask his opinion on things that had nothing to do with machinery at all, treating him, at last, like a person whose judgment was worth seeking out. One quiet evening, Helena noticed Evan leaving the office at 5:30 in the afternoon and asked, half joking, whether he had finally given up on working late for once. Evan checked his watch, allowed himself a small and unfamiliar smile, and told her simply that dinner started now, before walking out into daylight that still lingered warm and gold over the parking lot. He drove home while the sky was still bright, something his children had almost stopped expecting from him. June opened the front door before he even reached the porch. Miles was already setting plates carefully around the table, and Sadie had placed her father's chair squarely in the center, right where it belonged. For years, Evan had worked himself past exhaustion simply to make sure his children never went without a meal. And on that ordinary evening, for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, they did not just have food waiting for him on the table. They finally had their father sitting there beside them, present, unhurried, and home before the sun had even gone down.